Good afternoon and welcome to this panel, Empires in History. I am Romário Basílio and I read a short text as an introduction to this panel, I promise, with some questions of PhD candidates of this program. And this text was written by Bernardo Cruz, Franco Tomassoni, Teresa Furtado, and by me. We start the text talking about the use of metaphors in classical texts about globalization studies, like global village, spacecraft, first global revolution, new Babel, third wave, informatic society, road economy, global Disneyland, technocosmos, the end of geography, the end of history. The use of metaphors in studies about global phenomena since the 1980s is commonplace and talks a lot about the nature of the research projects in the area. Was the use of this kind of expressions a signal that 40 years ago we did not know enough about globalization processes? And nowadays, what do we know about globalization in historical perspective? In a panoramic view on traditional and recent historiography, what is the central question in globalization studies in historical perspective? It is important to compare traditions on the history of empires and its relations to global history. A traditional start point in some important historiographical analysis about the themes contains debates about the modern state and its role in the construction of nations and nationalism. Thus, the expansion of imperial systems unfold in forms of nation states and nationalism. At the same time, Marxism and its variants in postmodern perspectives tends to associate the stage of developments of capitalism as determinants of political experience and political structures. The central question is, does change in the model of production determines a change in forms of power? What is the relation between these notions with the history of globalization? The nature of and dimension of state power and the display of its capabilities have taken an important position. The processes of borders definitions were, for instance, a central process in imperial mobilization for legitimation. It is clear that recognition of mutual existence was important to empires, and the definition of borders was thus given a central role. British, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese empires were involved in countless conflicts for lands. The significance of mapping imperial geographical spaces, even the use of science and explorers, was a valuable tool to set up connections between imperial political projects and its domains. More than that, contestation between those empires and republics in Latin America, as Venezuela, Brazil, Guianas, into the 20th century, is paramount to demonstrate that those processes were related not only to a banal division of lands and a political definition of borders, but revealed a strong, resolute model of imperial strategies and a dense transformation in international laws in a global perspective. The answers, however, remains open. Can we consider the imperial expansion a stage for the emergence of capitalism, or should we emphasize the tension between the global markets and the national borders? We suggest that these questions are also particularly useful to understand the imperial construction and the globalization processes in the 20th century. Commonly, the potential productive osmosis between imperial history and the attempts to understand the globalization processes have been covered up by an interest in Cold War. The consequence of this enunciation is that the globalization wave that started in the 1970s is something completely new in historical development. Though this general understanding, a scarce contribution has been made to link the rising of the USA hegemony with the end of the European colonial empires. In counterpoint to this thesis, we propose to situate our scale between multinational corporations, colonies, and metropolitan powers. For example, if we consider the Portuguese colony of Angola and the presence of multinationals operating in the global energy market, we can find that the rising of the American hegemony has changed the negotiations between multinationals and the Portuguese colonial rule, as well as the structure of the concessionary and subsidiary contracts. These changes are part of a broader transformation in the general strategies of the companies in the colonial field. In a synchronic and diachronic comparison among different corporations, we reflect on why these transformations have happened. our analysis considered the variable of economic interest, know-how, financing capability, and anti-colonial movements. They offer a contribution to understand how the late Portuguese empires dealt with the wave of globalization. The way colonial companies operated in Portuguese colonies is one of the topics under study. The aim is to prepare the ground for a comparative analysis of colonial companies working in Angola that can be divided into several variables, such as the recruitment process, freedom of movement, policy and surveillance, welfare and propaganda programs, and of course, different degrees of bureaucratization. It is important not only to understand different ways of how these capitalist agents dealt with the labor force, mostly the different kind of physical and symbolic violence, as well as the similar social and paternalist ideologies, but also how geography and demography of the districts affected the private techniques of control. This theoretical exercise lies on the existence of a double sovereignty during the late Portuguese colonialism in Angola. There is not only on the consequence of the power of capitalist enterprises, but also in the consequence of the weakness of the infrastructural power and the Portuguese colonial state. This can be particularly evident in the diverse patterns of private responses to exogenous pressures, such as the Portuguese colonial war. But a study like this cannot be carried out without focusing on the global dimensions that are responsible for, in the majority of the cases, the birth of these companies. This is because companies were not only the result of national and overseas investment, but they were also dependent of the global market. One can say that the study concerning most of the Portuguese colonial companies is also the study of international capital and global elites movements. Without these arrangements between Lisbon, Luanda, and cities like Brussels, London, and New York, one cannot be able to understand the ways companies operated and the base of their ideologies and performances, especially since the ideas of modernization or development became central to colonial programs, particularly in demands for private investments in urbanization and social welfare in the labor village. As it happened with private enterprises, attempts to control and maintain a stable workforce, the notion of modernization was at the heart of the variety of policy proposals aimed at fixing and concentrating Africans, as well as at regulating their supposedly primitive modes of production. If it is true that such measures were a constant in British, French, Belgian, and Portuguese empires from the late 19th century onwards, the way they were conceived and deployed during the post-war period is still remarkably understudied, especially in the Portuguese case. Villagization in Angola, as in other Portuguese colony, was a central tenet to the counter-subversive strategy applied during the colonial war. It is estimated that over 1 million individuals were settled, with 3,000 aldeamentos in Angola by 1974. Starting in 1961, multiple methods for the concentration and regrouping of African populations were proposed. Despite the ostensible developmental rhetoric of many of these plans, as social engineering schemes prepared during guerrilla warfare, they came to rely on the deployment of repressive measures and resulted in aggravated social grievances. Scholarly accounts of the origins of such programs often highlight the international source of Portuguese military psychological doctrine in counter-guerrilla operations. British and French counter-subversion strategies were the main models. To be sure, inter-imperial transferences of knowledge played a significant role in Portugal's case, not least due to her peripheral position within the global empire system. However, too far a view can be misleading. Ideas of modernization alone do not account for institutional changes on the ground in global networks of exchange, with a focus on economic, social, and political tensions caused by globalization, have little to say on how particular environments within a colonial make extend populations and lands amenable to high modernist planning. For example, there is nothing explicitly global in the relation between medical inspections for the screening of African diseases and the military plans of concentrating African civilians. Nonetheless, the relation exists. We cannot understand the willingness of a variety of local actors for resorting to concentration schemes if we fail to recognize that round-up international deportations for medical reasons were customary and economically rational. Does this mean that we must recognize the validity of methodological nationalism? This is open to debate. And finally, in light of the first aid, we would like to finish this introduction with two striking questions for our speakers. Are the ideas of modernity and modernization still useful to empirical research? And second, what is particularly distinct to global studies in relation to comparative macro sociology? Again, are the ideas of modernity and modernization still useful to empirical research? And what is particularly distinct to global studies in relation to comparative macro sociology? Thank you.
I'm pleased to moderate this panel. It's an honor for me. I must make an amendment to the program because I'm not Álvaro Ferreira da Silva, a colleague. My colleague from the School of Business and Economics couldn't come, so I'm standing in for him. And it's an honor to be moderating this panel with such distinguished guests. We'll have, in order of appearance, Francesca Trivellato from the University of Yale, whom I had the pleasure of meeting a long time ago when she was doing her PhD at Brown University, and whose work on merchant networks and diasporas is a landmark for those who are interested in this topic. She has done many studies in this area, which include Sephardic Jews who are, of course, of interest for those who study the Portuguese Empire, the Portuguese expansion. So we are looking forward to hearing from her. Then we'll have Professor Jack Goldstone from George Mason University. And Professor Goldstone is one of the most prominent specialists on global history, on true global history. And you cannot study such big questions as the ascendancy of the West without knowing the work of Professor Goldstone. So we are also anxious to hear from him. And finally, my good friend and colleague Diogo Ramada Curto, who has long studied the Portuguese Empire in a comparative perspective, and who recently has broadened his interests in terms of chronology and geography to the study of the Portuguese Empire in the 20th century. And he is also one of the promoters of global studies in Portugal, and especially in Nova University. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Francesca Trivellato.
Thank you very much, both to Diogo Ramada Curto and everybody for the invitation. And I need to preface my presentation by saying that the very inspiring and spirited panel this morning left me, and I'm sure many of you, with a rather sobering sense of what is the purpose of an academic historian. Something I don't like to think about it. I have a very privileged academic life that allows me not to dwell too much on this complicated question. And I realized that are not specialists. My paper will be focused on problems that have been addressed primarily by scholars of early modern Europe, early modern being the period between, say, the Renaissance and the French Revolution, but also a concept that Jack Goldstone and others have helped conceptualize in potentially broader and planetary sense, and that is used, therefore, among other things, to think about possibilities of comparisons within and beyond Europe. And it is an attempt to think about what, from an academic point of view, to me is the meaning of this conference. That is, how does new knowledge and new way of thinking about the past can be produced within an academic environment. I'm very happy to take any sorts of questions, even if the paper may seem a little specialized. I don't mind naive questions. I teach a brilliant, ignorant undergraduates, so that's fine. So I thought I would begin with a rather long quotation that to those of you who are familiar with the history of early modern Europe will probably be familiar. I first came upon Alhazen Alhazen description of Africa more than 40 years ago when I just completed my doctoral dissertation on Protestantism and the printing workers of 16th century Lyon. But my attention then was on something else, on the confrontation of worker with employer, of layman with cleric, within the dense life of a French city, subjects little attended to by the historians writing in the 1950s. The encounter between Europe and Africa in the description seemed far away and less urgent. The conversation I was trying to fathom were from Catholic to Protestant. In the mid-1990s, the relation between European and non-European populations was at the center of things, and polar ways of thinking were being challenged. It seemed a fine moment to return to Jean-Léon l'Africain, who had begun to think of Alhazen Alhazen, the name he had for most of his life. I now also had family connections with his part of the world, in Morocco and Tunisia. Through his example, I could explore how a man moved between different polities, made use of different cultural and social resources, and entangled or separated them so as to survive, discover, write, make relationships, and think about society and himself. So for those of you who are specialists, you would know that this passage is lifted from the preface to Trickster's Travelers, a 16th century Muslim between worlds, by one of the greatest historian of the 20th and 21st century, Natalie Zemon Davis. And these lines seems to me to encapsulate two hallmarks of her career. First, the bold and open acknowledgement of her autobiographical investment in her research subjects, and her ability to chart new scholarly pathways. And so given the brilliance and the impact that Natalie Zemon Davis' work has had in the historical profession, not just among early modernists, but really among all historians, it seemed interesting for the purpose of this panel to pause even briefly, as she did in the introduction of her latest book, on the difference between her earlier work on the very famous book, The Return of Monturguer, which is the one in which she studied 16th century Lyon, which was a film with Gérard Depardieu that came out the year before her book, and she was a consultant on the film. And I think these passage prompts us to reflect on the theme of this conference, namely, how did the global turn emerge? How did somebody like Zemon Davis went from studying 16th century Lyon to write about a Muslim who was taken captive and lived for several years, forcibly baptized at the court of Rome, at the Pope? And most importantly, whether this supposed global turn disrupt existing historiographical paradigms, and what new challenges did it put before us? And I just want to mention that I think Diogo's paper later will argue that there isn't such a thing as the global turn, because Europeanists have written about world history for a long, long, long time, since the 18th century at the very least. And I would like to suggest that there is no contradiction between what I'm going to say and what he will say, but that may be left for the discussion. So my presentation is divided in two parts. First, I will offer a few remarks on the trends that have characterized the global turn in the practice of historical writing in general, and specifically in the field of early modern Europe as practiced in the United States. And the second part, I will turn to some key works on empire and comparative history. And my provocative, hopefully, point throughout the paper will be that I believe that global historians currently wrestle with the very same fundamental problem that the most innovative social historians of the 1970s and 80s were concerned with, namely the relationship between micro and macro scales of analysis, which is also the problem of how to identify analogies, comparable phenomena, differences, or as the title of the talk, which differences make a difference, and thus how to move from particularities and generalizations. So I don't want my remarks to sound reactionary, sort of you know, a glorification of times before my time, but the rather sobering lessons I am trying to draw from the last 2 decades of inebriation with global history, I hope are meant to push us to think harder about what future directions we may wish to pursue. So the first part, which difference does global history make to the practice of history? And I begin with a paper that was very influential, published just a year ago, gave us, many of us, a lot to think about. Jeremy Edelman, a distinguished Latin Americanist and global historian at Princeton University, captured the mood of many with an incisive online essay. This is not behind a paywall, so everybody can read it. That mused on the recent and rapid rise of global history and its seemingly imminent demise. In the wake of Trump's victory and the backlashes against globalization the world over, Edelman wrote, quote, "Global historians seemed out of step with their times." His diagnosis is timely and perceptive. Edelman warned us that to have a future, global history needs to cease feeding usable past to elite advocates or consumers of globalizations, whether the cynical types or the true believers in the power of connections, mobility, and communication to forge a more interdependent and compassionate world. I have long worried about the romanticizing of cross-cultural encounters that suffuses many accounts of early modern historians who write in this new vein. And my own dabbling in global history was a clear attempt to counter such romanticizing, on one of its privileged terrain, the idea that religious animosity recedes in the face of economic opportunities and the marketplace were fertile grounds for equal and peaceful encounters. And I refer to the book that Jorge Pedreira generously referred to, which was published in 2009 and studies a group of Sephardic merchants in the 18th century and includes a lot of material from the Lisbon archives. As much as I share Edelman's concerns, I worry that it may be premature to issue a death certificate for global history. And I say I worry because I fear that its survival may be due to both good and bad reasons. The good reasons are many, and they're still with us. And taken together, the multiple and varied works inspired by the rising tide of the global turn in the 1990s have cumulatively achieved something significant, if not the general reorientation of historical writing away from Western-centric provincialism, at least an awareness of that provincialism. In the United States, political pundits often criticize academics for being collectively to the left of the general population and for undermining the achievements of so-called Western civilization. In fact, hard data, this is collected by the American Historical Association, shows that the erosion of European and US history in the past 40 years, as judged by the fields of specialization of those teaching in history departments in the United States, has been slow and certainly more significant than in European and in US history. It has not been a dramatic decline in the teaching of US history in the wake of the rise of global history. At the same time, the rise and the growth of world history, which is a little bit different, and we can talk about the semantics later, as a field has been most rapid, and I venture to guess is largely due to curricular changes in large state universities rather than in elite colleges or Ivy universities. And for example, the two most innovative and prominent PhD programs, doctoral programs in world history, were founded by Patrick Manning, first at Northeastern University in Boston and then at Pittsburgh University. So far away from the most elite citadels of knowledge. And demographic changes in the US population, it must be said, more than liberal engineering from the top, as often decried, account for these trends. This is reliable projections from the US Census Bureau. So the people, the consumers of these classes need to hear about histories that resembles some of their own constructed and family pasts. But there are also some bad reasons, if one wants to be simplistic, for global history widespread appeal. They've been there from the start and show no sign of abating. Edelman is careful to note that at least within the academy, several historians have drawn attention to the violence and that has made the world more and more interconnected since the 16th century, if not before, and to the asymmetry of power that has characterized past forms of transcultural encounters. But his central point, I think, is very well taken. And his central point is that an excessively ironic vision of all proto-globalization phenomena has prevailed and is out of sync with the current reality around us. For our purposes, more than these good and bad reasons that have to do with academic politics broadly construed, I think for the purpose of this conference, we ought to discuss the reasons internal to the discipline of history, which account for what I would describe as the weak methodological proposals that global historians have made. Or to put it succinctly, I worry less about the impending death of global history than about its uncritical longevity. With characteristically synthetic acumen in her writing history in the global era, Lynn Hunt has identified, quote, 4 major paradigms of historical research in the post-World War II era: Marxism, modernization, the Annales School, and in the United States especially, identity politics, end of quote. She uses the word paradigm with explicit reference to the definition offered in 1962 by noted historians of science Thomas Kuhn. The processes through which scientific communities establish and then revoke a consensus on research questions and the methods through which to address them. For Hunt, a more globally oriented history today represents a new paradigm, one that, quote, might well serve to encourage a sense of international citizenship, of belonging to the world and not just to one's own nationality, she writes, even if she's careful to note that this outcome is as yet far more of a promise than a reality. Hunt detects some of the most innovative areas of this new globally oriented history in the collaborations between humanists and neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and evolutionary biologists, and urges her colleagues in history department to submit some of the most venerable areas of Western cultural history, including the history of emotions, the body, and the self, to novel types of investigation that transcend cultural boundaries, as well as disciplinary boundaries. She goes as far as to suggest that a combination of, quote, psychological and social, intra-European and global factors, end of quote, may explain what she calls the general increase in emotional energy that accompanied the rise of capitalism. This is a bold hypothesis, yet it remains unclear how we are to test it. A paradigm, Hunt reminds us, is, quote, an overarching account or meta-narrative of historical developments that include 1, a hierarchy of factors that determine meaning, and 2, an agenda for research. How, I ask, is the more globally oriented history she advocates a paradigm in the ways in which the other 4 she identified, Marxism, modernization theory, the Annales School, and broadly construed identity politics, are? In fact, none of the coherence or the methodological belligerence that characterized any of the other paradigms Hunt singles out holds global history together. The expression global history itself is vague and only one among others used to indicate a cluster of approach and thematic foci, We can discuss if there is a difference between the Journal of World History, which the late Jerry Bentley founded in 1991, versus the Journal of Global History that has been produced out of London primarily, and SOAS to some extent. And obviously there are interesting intersecting enterprises such as the Journal of Early Modern History without a geographical characterization. Overall, it seems fair to say that global history today stands for an assortment of styles and questions linked by a common desire to write a history that takes multiple points of view and multiple archives into consideration, that sheds preconstituted assumptions about the privileged point of observation aside. But we also need to recognize that global history may not be a paradigm after all. It is an aspiration at best, and perhaps the voice of a generation and its discontent. Part 2. Which difference makes a difference in the comparative history of early modern empires? At first sight, empires represent the old rather than the new in historical writing. But the disillusionment with the promises of liberal pluralistic nation states since the end of the Cold War, and the simple realizations that ancient and modern empires covered vast stretches of the earth, have brought empires back to the fore of historiographical debates. Here, I wish to explore a paradox. The microhistory of the 1980s and 90s, which in some ways is epitomized, although not fully represented, by Natalie Zemon Davis with The Return of Martin Guerre, her first book, which I evoked earlier, that microhistory was born as a reaction against political history and took the local as its mantra. In fact, ironically, microhistory and the new global history of empires face the same set of challenges, namely how to intersect microanalysis with comparative history, how to build generalizations and taxonomies from the intense exploration of the particularity of each place, time, case, individual. At the time, Italian microhistorians devised a clever and thought-provoking, but only partially, I would say, satisfactory answer to this dilemma. And whenever they would be asked, what is the representativeness of your case? Perhaps some of you are familiar with a very famous book by Carla Ginzburg, The Cheese and the Worms, that has made a 16th century Miller from Friuli, a world-renowned figure, Menocchio. So that's only the most well-known of a number of very probing and important publications in the vein of Italian microhistory. And when asked about the representative of, who does Menocchio stand for, they dismissed the question as the wrong question. The exceptionality of the primary sources documenting those case studies, they argued, matter more than the individual case's representativeness. Menocchio may have been eccentric, but had he not spoken liberally in front of the inquisitors, we historians would not know what illiterate peasants in 16th century Friuli and the Counter-Reformation thought. Had a Piedmontese parish priest, citing a different and equally important work of Giovanni Levi, another Italian microhistorian of the period, had a Piedmontese parish priest not kept a diary of his exorcism, we would not be able to reconstruct the thick networks of credit and power in the periphery of a 17th century absolutist state, and therefore challenge more conventional histories of state building and the rise of market economies. The emphasis on the exceptionality of the paper trail, often summarized in the slogan of the normally exceptional, was more than a clever escamotage. It led social and cultural historians in the 1980s and 90s to cultivate a new relationship with the archives and to test received historiographical wisdom against new or newly read primary sources. But is it possible to do comparative history, sometimes on a planetary scale, with primary sources? Many historians think it is at the very least difficult, if not impossible, which is one of the reasons why comparative history enjoys a very mixed reputation in history departments. Comparative history is often praised as the superior form of inquiry in the abstract, but few get their hands dirty at it, and graduate students are urged to specialize and discouraged from taking on exceedingly vast a topic. Senior scholars are often all too aware of the pitfalls of comparative history, and some shun it precisely because of its derivative nature. The new global history of empires is eminently comparative and dependent on the availability of a great many secondary sources. Empire in World History, Power and the Politics of Difference, written by Jane Burbeck, a specialist of Imperial Russia, and Freddie Cooper, a leading scholar of African modern imperialism, and published in 2010, is arguably the most ambitious, synthetic, and analytical effort in this field. It covers examples from ancient Rome to the Second World War. It is rich in insights and driven by the desire to demonstrate the continuity between pre-modern and modern empires, and thus to question a certain idea about the inevitability of democracy's ascent. Yet, to accomplish their task, Burbeck and Cooper operate with an overly capacious definition. Empires, they write, are large political units, expansionist or with a memory of power extended over space, polities that maintain distinction and hierarchy as they incorporate new people. The concept of empire presumes that different people within the polity will be governed differently, so they will have different taxation system or different systems of justice and so forth. This definition comes with two corollaries. First, its level of generality is such that Burbeck and Cooper are obliged to admit that ultimately there is no such thing as an empire, but only imperial repertoires, each distinctive, influential, and in many cases entwined. We're thus back at the beginning with an irreconcilable tension between particularities and general patterns. The tension is resolved in this book in a rather conventional formulation that states that the empire states declare the non-equivalence of multiple populations, while the nation states proclaim the commonality of its people. And it's not clear to me how we needed global history to arrive at this contraposition, this opposition. Second, although Burbeck and Cooper are careful to avoid any value judgment, by defining empires as polities that manage differences, they implicitly put violence on the periphery. They emphasize contingent accommodation, the role of intermediaries, the fact that, quote, for many empires, loyalty, not likeness, was the goal. In fact, we know that extraction, exploitation, and even extermination were at the very heart of many imperial projects. The wide-ranging comparative approach championed by Burbeck and Cooper strike me as reminiscent of Carlo Ginzburg's effort to blend microhistory and morphology for the purpose of reconstructing the witch's Sabbath on a planetary scale in his dense and lesser-known ecstasies. But a morphological method is predicated on a recognition of similarities that can be rather subjective. Criticizing Oswald Spengler's highly influential and highly problematic The Decline of the West, in 1921, Robert Musil offered one of the earliest and most trenchant takedown of morphology, admittedly using a phrase that I cite, but that is obviously racist by our standards. Quote, there are lemon yellow butterflies and there are lemon yellow Chinese. In a certain sense, one can say that the butterfly is the winged Middle European dwarf Chinese. To put it in my own words, which difference makes a difference in the comparative history of global empires? Kenneth Pomerantz's The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy, published in 2000, and possibly the most influential book written by a historian in the past quarter century, adopts a different approach and thus showcases different strengths and weaknesses of comparative history. It is often described as a contribution to world history, and it truly is that, but it does not survey the entire world in broad brushes. its most impressive methodological contribution consists in the way in which it combines micro and macro analysis. Pomerantz famously argues that A, England was not more economically advanced in the Yangtze Delta region through the 18th century, and two, that the Industrial Revolution occurred in England not because of advantages accumulated over centuries, but because of the rather accidental proximity of coal to manufacturing plant sites and the perhaps less accidental control of slave labor and captive markets in the Caribbean. In order to demonstrate this dual thesis, Pomerantz relies on secondary sources, but the range of sources and the command of the literature are impressive. Most importantly, he puts the secondary sources in the service of a fine-grained set of comparison of a number of key economic indicators, including the structure of household, labor, consumptions, standard of livings, proto-industry, and so forth. In other words, Pomerantz not only put forth a bold thesis, but provides a model for how to put microanalysis in the service of macro history. Yet the Great Divergence has also been criticized. One group of critics focus on its unit of analysis. Are they Europe and China, as the book's subtitle, or the most advanced regions of England and China? And why does this distinction matter? A second group of criticism has to do with the fact that the secondary literature on which the book relies was developed for purposes other than comparative history, and that he may have cherry-picked some of his evidence. Can we really compare famous problem in the book, family budgets from the 1930s, the earliest one surviving for China, with those of pre-industrial England? Finally, some ask if the specific comparanda of the book can be compared in the first place. Did household mean the same thing in the two regions? Did putting out textile industry work in the same way? These are all legitimate concerns, and they're also the very same concern that animate scholars such as Simona Cerutti and Isabelle Grangot, who have been influenced by the Italian microhistory, and who in a recent article in Comparative Studies in Society and History remind us that historians' resistance to comparative history is a measure of the fear that comparison may be in conflict with the diversity of context to which the objects of comparison belong. The local specificity of terms such as family, labor, religion, or any other term cast doubt on the possibility of comparing such phenomena. My last example comes again from the literature on the Great Divergence. Before and Beyond Divergence, The Politics of Economic Change in China and Europe was published in 2011 by Bing Wang, a historian of China, who together with Pomerantz spearheaded the revisionist approach to this topic, and Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, an economist who, unusual among his colleagues, conducts archival research, mostly in France, for his own brand of economic history. Rosenthal and Wang develop a complementary but different approach from the one put forth by Pomerantz, one that is significantly more deductive and more comfortable with the asymmetry of empirical evidence that plagues most comparison between Chinese and European economic systems. Thus, they outline plausible scenarios that remain to be tested. In their story, kinship structures play no role, while geopolitical determinants, warfare, and patterns of urbanizations are decisive. They reason that the vastness of China's agrarian empire required a different taxation system and no public debt, which is why it would be wrong to blame China for not having a public debt. Similarly, they stress that the vastness of the Chinese empire allowed merchants operating over long distances to count on the same legal system and on the absence of internal tariffs to a degree unknown in the politically fragmented Europe. Ultimately, Rosenthal and Wang's contribution consists in demonstrating that comparative history need not search for identical institutions across time and place, but should rather understand why different society may have either developed different solutions to the same problem, in this case, state capacity, legal institution, private and public finance, or simply they may have faced different problems in the first place. Reviewing their book in the American Historical Review, the eminent economic historian Jan de Vries concluded, Unfortunately, historical evidence that might actually test their theories is largely unavailable. The reader is left with an account of how imperial China was economically efficient in theory, but not in fact. This criticism is not unwarranted, but misconstrues the book's overall message. I suspect that Rosenthal and Wang would readily admit that their empirical basis is often thin, as long as the criticism is turned into an encouragement to other scholars to test or reject their hypothesis. In short, here we encounter yet another way, the way preferred by social scientists rather than by traditional historians, to address the tension between particularities and generalities. To conclude, I simply wish to reiterate the paradox I put before you from the beginning. The future challenges of global history are not radically different from the challenges that historical writing has been facing for a good century. Of course, the question of sources and languages figure prominently when we deal with multiple localities, archives, and population, and I don't think it's coincidental that a lot of these books are co-written by specialists of different areas. But the central conundrum remains the same: how to build models from the bottom up, how to build models that preserve the inescapable heterogeneity of history. In a brilliant essay, first conceived in 1939, The Civilizing Process, Norbert Elias famously sought to link the introduction of the fork and new table manners to the ultimate macro phenomena, European state building. Imperfect as all grand theories are, is path-breaking and genial intersection of the micro and macro scale of analysis of the psychological and the sociological and other such classic works are worth remembering to make sure we do not reinvent the wheel. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Now I will give the floor to Professor Goldstone.
Over here. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in Lisbon, in the capital of the first great European empire. The ruthlessness and brutality with which that empire was founded may leave one anxious about claiming credit for it. But this was in many ways no different than any of the European empires, all of which depended on a great deal of violence in order to become established. Indeed, that's one of the tendencies that we are facing now in the modern world, the reassertion of violence, and I would argue, surprisingly, a reassertion of empire as well. And the provocation of my talk is that I'm voicing an anxiety. I hope it's not a correct one, but it's nonetheless real to me, that we may be living in kind of the end of the golden age of global democracy, and that the dominance of empires, which has been enormous throughout world history, may be reasserting itself. Now, the empire as a form of government, as Francesca said, is coming back under scrutiny, partly because of the recognition that most of human recorded history takes place in polities that were organized as empires. That is to say, this imperial form in which the head of state was a hereditary ruler with supreme power to command the government and make laws, in which there was usually a semi-hereditary landowning elite ruling the countryside. There was an elite of bureaucratic and military officers that were usually, not always, but usually drawn from that landowning elite. Cities that existed as administrative and commercial centers, but subject to the imperial authority. A state religion that legitimates the ruler, is supported by the ruler, and most strikingly, rigid inequalities with subjects in the empire that were passive and elites that were privileged. Now, this form of government is found more or less everywhere, from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, China, India, Persia, North Africa, the Middle East, Mesoamerica. European monarchies fit this as well. If you take the 5,000 years of recorded history and consider that to be kind of stretched out over a mile, the period of history, recent history, in which constitutional republican government has been widespread is at most the 70 years since World War II. So if you were going to walk a mile, your first 3 or 4 steps would exhaust the history of the constitutional democratic era, and the rest of your stroll would be through imperial history. There were differences, of course, and the way we characterize the history of empires and their place in world history very much affects what we think of modernization and where we are in the modern world. Now, in the modernization narrative, traced, say, to the narrative of history in Herodotus, our first historian gave us this template, the eastern part of the civilized world was under absolutist empires that were large in size but lacking in individual freedom. The Western world, as epitomized in the Greek city-states, developed ideals of citizenship and democracy. And if you believe the modernization theory narrative, there's a fairly continuous strain from the city-states and citizenship of the ancient Greeks through the Roman Republic, then in the medieval period, the free cities of Europe, the city-states of northern Italy, and then eventually the larger representative republics in the Dutch Republic, the United States, Britain, and so on. And so these notions of citizenship and constitutions go back for over 2,000 years in the West and continuously reappear until they assert themselves and finally become dominant with the onset of the modern world after about 1800. The problem with that narrative is that it greatly exaggerates, with the virtue of hindsight, the importance of citizenship and democracy in the broader history of human civilization. That is to say, the idea of citizenship and democracy was never workable on any large scale. It remained characteristic of small city-states, whether this was true in Greece or in medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy. The military force of large empires was always able to prevail over the liberty and freedom of small city-states. The battles that Herodotus chronicled between Persia and Greece were somewhat the exception, but the outcome of the Greek victory was the rise of an Athenian empire rather than the triumph of and spread of a city-state ideal. In fact, a century or so after the Persian Wars, Macedonia started to grow. The Macedonian Empire overcame the Greek city-states, and Hellenic civilization spread throughout the Middle East as an imperial state form. The Roman city-state could not survive the spread of Roman power, even though citizenship and some of the appearances of republican government remained. The Senate remained an extremely elite body, and eventually civil wars within the senatorial class ended the Roman Republic and created the Roman Empire. The history in the East was somewhat different. Empires in the East were periodically interrupted by nomadic barbarians who spread from the steppes both into Turkey, into India, and into China. But in the East, where this imperial form of government had been well established, the nomads adopted the ruling formula of the empires that they overran. So whether it was the Mongols and Manchus in China, or the barbarians who became sultans in Persia and India, the Turks' establishment of the Ottoman Empire using largely Persian statecraft, and in the West, Frankish kings, who were also kind of barbarian conquerors, adopted the imperial Roman model wherever they could. The difference was that in Europe, the barbarian kings fought each other for centuries without a victor. They never quite recovered the wealth or power of Roman emperors. Thus, European kings were confronted with residual claims to liberty from estates, free cities, and corporations that managed to maintain themselves in the interstices of the feuding royal monarchies. In Asia, however, the barbarians were able to take over large empires managed to reinstate central absolutist authority, and so these claims for free estates or free cities or corporations never developed. Nonetheless, while one can say that in Western Europe in particular, the power of imperial leaders was less than in their Eastern counterparts, that was partly because it took much longer after the fall of the Roman Empire for them to reestablish their monarchies, and they wasted a lot of resources in fighting with them, each other. But even so, these ancient claims to liberty were on the verge of being extinguished by the 17th century. That is, by the time of Westphalia, the natural order, as the economists Doug North, Michael Wallace, and Barry Weingast have called it, the natural order of privileged elites, vulnerable populations, and religious and traditional legitimation of supreme rulers was undermining and debilitating the estates, parliaments, and their local liberties. The divine right of kings and Roman law were being combined to inspire absolute kings to rule in the image of Roman emperors. Now, this gets us to the Ken Pomerantz model that Francesca raised. They said, well, there weren't any huge differences between the advanced regions of Europe and China. I think that's true economically, technologically. There weren't any big differences in the level of family income, individual wealth. But there were differences, and that was that the European states were weaker and more backwards than the Asian empires. That's the opposite of what we usually say in modernization theory. Normally, European advance is credited with the ability to draw on the Renaissance, draw on the scientific traditions of ancient Greece. But that's European history. The fact of the matter is, in a world history perspective, it was Islamic science that revived European science. It was the desire to conduct import substitution for the advanced ceramic and textile manufacturers of Asia and China that motivated Europeans to try to improve themselves. And it was a desire to avoid dependence on the East Mediterranean trade routes that impelled Europeans to set sail and cross the Atlantic. So all of these deficiencies led Europeans to try and expand their world, and when they did so, they found out kind of how isolated and backwards they were. That is to say, European cosmology still in the 16th century depended on the ancient Greek authors, whereas the Asian major civilizations had been able to develop a more or less continuous and frequently revived tradition of science and philosophy based on their ancient texts. The Europeans, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, had lost connection with much of the corpus of ancient Greek writing. The revival in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, with the gradual reacquisition of classics, partly through Islamic translations, led to a struggle to reconcile the patristic Christian literature with the philosophy and science of the ancient Greeks. And that task, which was enormously difficult, was undertaken successfully, so that the medieval philosophers in the West managed to combine a selective Aristotelian physics and cosmology with biblical interpretation and create the kind of St. Thomas of Aquinas marvelous synthesis that was the basis for royal and church authority. But as I say, the problem with that is it was not very adaptable. Chinese science was familiar with supernovae, had a philosophy based on the change of things. Islamic science was familiar with Greek, Sanskrit, and Chinese sources, and particularly Persian science, and integrated all of these things. The Europeans, however, did not integrate. They had their kind of rigid biblical and classical synthesis, and that was crushed by the discoveries of the 16th and 17th centuries. That is, the geography of the New World, the existence of supernovae, the elliptical movement of planets, when these things were discovered, they substantially undermined the prestige and authority of the church and tradition to which European monarchs had tied themselves. Now, as we've heard about the Inquisition this morning, the Counter-Reformation fought back fiercely. And where it succeeded, particularly in Spain, Italy, and Poland, kings and the Catholic Church remained absolute. And frankly, even where the Reformation triumphed, kings who converted to Protestantism managed to keep their divine right, particularly in Prussia and Sweden. So even a century and a half after the Reformation, monarchies remained dominant in Europe. But there was one country where the traditional parliament grew in strength, partly the result of accidents, which first religious conflicts, the result of a succession that brought Catholicism close to the English throne, that first led Parliament to depose not only a king, but kingship and the Church of England itself in 1641. But that was too radical. It didn't take. And it was only because, again, in 1688, a Catholicizing king ran into conflict with the Protestant elites that Parliament was led to assert its control over succession and state finances. And then finally, in the early 1800s, another failure of succession led to the importation of a German monarchy, which depended on Parliament to run the country, producing Parliament's growing influence after 1714. Nonetheless, by the 1770s, the British monarchy was still asserting its absolute right over its colonies, including the colonies in North America. But by that time, rationalism and modern science had started to undermine the authority of religious and traditional beliefs. The British North American colonies, therefore, became the first large country to abolish kingship entirely in favor of a rationally constructed form of representative republic. Now, this was a real anomaly, as I mentioned, compared to thousands of years of imperial rule. But this anomaly was justified on the basis of the new science of politics, which employed a skeptical analysis of history. It also revived some of the ancient republican reforms, but with no hereditary aristocratic elite. Now, this American constitutional government had three unusual sources. One was the rational scientific equality of everyone in pursuit of knowledge. That is, no one was considered to have a privileged view of nature, nothing like the revelation of the church that was known only to priests. Rather, every rational adult was considered equal in the pursuit of knowledge. Second, America benefited from a relatively egalitarian distribution of income with abundance, rather than a highly unequal distribution based on scarcity, which was dominant in all of the long-settled regions of the world. And finally, Protestantism as the dominant religion meant there were no entrenched, privileged religious elites to deal with. Now, this American outcome, that is, a large representative republic without hereditary elites, proved very hard to duplicate. The British struggled through their reform movement in the 19th century, but retained the hereditary House of Lords all the way to the 20th century, and still has hereditary monarchs, although they exert less influence today. France tried to abolish its monarchy in 1792, but that did not take either, and France continued to have monarchies and empires recurring up until 1870. In Russia and Germany, monarchies remained up till the end of World War I. China kept its emperor to 1911, but even where emperors were deposed, the new systems that arose often recreated privileged elites and absolute rulers, this time in the form of party states. Now, in Europe, the Industrial Revolution created greater optimism and faith in rational reasoning, and the combination of faith in the Industrial Revolution, belief that rationally created constitutions provided better government, these two beliefs challenged monarchs throughout the world. nonetheless the combination of religion and tradition remained strong. And in the 19th century, I should say the middle and late 19th century, Romanticism came along and bonded nationalism to the combination of religion and tradition to create a new rationale for strong rulers leading absolute states. That is, the strong ruler would be the champion of the nation and defend what was most important in the religion and tradition of the nation against threats from the rest of the world. To this day, that imperial nationalistic model remains dominant in Russia and China, and remains appealing and staging a return in Thailand and Turkey, and even in regimes across Latin America and Africa. In particular, wherever insecurity arises, we see the national imperial model of government drawing support. We certainly saw it in the 1930s across Europe, and we're seeing it again now across the Middle East and parts of Asia. And in fact, it's striking. If you saw this week in the news, you probably know that Turkey and the United States are clashing in the Middle East, where US-supported Kurdish forces in Syria are being attacked by Turkish troops. The head of state in Turkey, a secular elected leader, threatened that if the United States continued to pursue this folly, they would suffer an Ottoman slap. Now, the anomaly of having an elected parliamentary leader threaten the most powerful democratic republic in the world with a slap in the name of an old deposed empire, bizarre as it is, makes my point about the appeal of the imperial model. And as I say, it's this 19th century romantic model that fuses strong nationalism and a selective respect for religion and tradition. So Erdogan is kind of rebuilding his notion of a modern but nonetheless Islamic and Turkish state in the modern state of Turkey that hopes to have an expanded sphere of influence similar to that of the old Ottoman Empire. That is, it would be dominant in the northern Middle East. Similarly, Russia wants to maintain an imperial role throughout Central Asia and the Caucasus. In fact, it's already been involved in invasions to take territory in Georgia, in Moldova, and now in Ukraine. China insists that the provinces of Xinjiang, which is mostly or has been mostly populated by Muslim Uyghurs, and Tibet are parts, inherent and inseparable parts of China. Well, that only makes sense if you see China as an empire, and China is going beyond that, claiming that all of the areas of the Western Pacific, certainly the first island line and maybe even the second island line, are part of the natural domain where Chinese superiority should take over. And you can see the world being kind of carved up again to where China wants to control the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia. Russia wants to control its immediate neighboring territories as well as its own country. The United States and Europe are kind of holding on to trying to control the North Atlantic alliance, and Turkey, Iran are both exerting themselves trying to build up imperial spheres of influence throughout the Middle East. The United States, which previously had been champion of a global order in which something like the United Nations and the European Union, that is, supra-international institutions to create legal frameworks under which different nations would operate collectively to impose a common order, is now retreating from that. The U.S. is retreating from its support for the UN, it's retreating from its support for NATO, it's disengaging from multilateral trade agreements, and is indeed saying we expect other nations to place their own interests first, just like the United States will place its own interests first. And this again reduces the world to a zone of contestation among competing empires, each seeking to maximize their own interests in pursuit of their own goals. It throws out the notion that that there could be a common framework for different nations, like the Declaration of Human Rights, like international trade laws, in which all nations act similarly in support of a common goal. Well, if you throw that out, we're back to the world of empires, pure and simple. And indeed, if economic insecurity over immigration threatening the integrity of national culture, and physical insecurity, fears of conflict and terrorism start to arise, people are likely to fall back to their support for stronger governments to protect them. Now, we saw a major recession in 2007, 2009, deeply weaken the certainty that Western countries had that they were in control of their economic future and that they had mastered the principles of eliminating the business cycle. That proved to be a great mistake. It's possible that we will see a larger, even greater recession in the next decade, and if we do, we could see a return to the insecurity that led to the current wave of electoral support for strong nationalistic leaders. I hope that doesn't occur. That is, I hope a new wave of technological progress based on perhaps renewable energy, based on improvements in biology, genetics, medical care, brings a sense of security and abundance. Because in an atmosphere of security and abundance, democracy should spread. I would say, in evolutionary terms, democratic republics have been like a mutant or a sport in history, which survived only in certain environments. When that favorable environment spreads, so does that species. But the imperial model is more like the dinosaurs. They were dominant almost everywhere and for almost all of recorded history. What's more, in its late 19th century form, that is the romantic nationalist authoritarian state, the imperial model still recurs. And my fear is that it may dominate in environments of insecurity, and unless we return to a world in which nations pursue a common international legal framework, a common set of international human rights, we will find ourselves back in the world of empires, and democracy itself may start to fade away. If China and Russia look like the more successful modes of social and political organization, if Europe and the United States look to be insecure, ineffective, I have to say the school shootings in the United States, of which one occurred just this week, create the impression of the weakness of democracy. So in China and Russia, news like this is widely spread as evidence that democracies cannot keep their children safe, that they breed conflict, violence, and therefore are to be avoided. And if that is the world that we're in, where empires look good and democracies look ineffective and weak, we may, as I said, in the broader framework of world history, see the powerful imperial model of government reassert itself everywhere.
Well, we had two thought-provoking interventions, so we are now leading to our third paper. Diogo.
We are moving towards a more pedestrian approach to all these problems, and perhaps I'll take another avenue regarding the paper that I wrote for this presentation, in order to address and to be more realistic and to address some of the questions that Francesca, Trivellato, and Jack Goldstone have brought to this forum. And the first thing that I'd like to say concerns ways of writing global and imperial history in Lisbon, precisely. And I think that is much more interesting to face your North American perspectives with these perhaps more realistic perspective, or at least a different perspective embedded in Portuguese political culture, in Portuguese academia, and with all the limitations that we can claim, but at the same time with a different point of view. The work that we have trying to develop here is not or cannot be considered a work that is done assuming that we are in a sort of periphery regarding the great centers that have all the conditions. On the contrary, what we are trying to do is precisely to break unequal terms of exchange, publishing people like Pomeranz, like Jack Goldstone, like Frederick Cooper, like Francesca Trivellato, and others. Not to use them as a kind of model, but on the contrary, making a point and trying, first of all, to study your works in your own context. I always remember in the introduction of another book by Barrington Moore, a piece that was well researched by my colleague Miguel Jerónimo, in the sense of recreating precisely the conditions, the political conditions where Barrington Moore at Harvard wrote the piece on the origins of democracy and totalitarianism. And how much he was linked to State Departments or to the State Department and to different state agencies in order to develop his own research projects. The second thing that I would like to say, also to characterize our way of writing and making global history, national history, imperial history, concerns the political debate here in Portugal. It's more than evident that in comparison to North America great schools, we are here in Portugal much more, or we are forced to take position in political terms in a way that is much more evident than perhaps you are. So the politicization of Portuguese academia, even when people try to deny that that kind of pressure doesn't exist, is much more evident. Perhaps precisely because we will live in a country where the colonial and imperial memory is very fresh. So when we are addressing the 15th century or the 16th century, when we are saying, as it was said last year, that Lisbon in the 16th century, for instance, was a global city, that kind of statements have a sort of political orientation that cannot be avoided. And so these are perhaps the two conditions that we need to consider in order to write global or imperial history. In what way are we addressing Portuguese historiography regarding what is produced abroad. How can we use models, control those models, and develop a much more reflexive position regarding what are the main historiographical debates in the Anglo-American world, and at the same time, what are the political implications of what we are writing on when we are addressing questions on global history and on imperial history. And I would like to make, I mean, based on these two first ideas, I would like to make 4 or 5 points and to clarify 4 or 5 points that are at least partially in my paper. The first concerns, as a matter of fact, something that Francesca Trivellato has already referred, which means that the notion of global history, or the notion of a global turn, recent global turn in history, which is perhaps very useful in order to make sense of the works of Pomerantz or Lynn Hunt or others. Perhaps for us it makes no sense. Perhaps it will be more important, it would be much more important to accept that during the 3 last centuries we have been living under a series of different worlds, global histories, and our Western knowledge of the world is nowadays bigger in comparison to what was the knowledge of the world before at least the Enlightenment. I don't go through the different moments and to the different characterizations or the different moments where some configurations of world history took place in Europe and in the Western world during the last centuries, but I take seriously the contributions, all the contributions that were made, for instance, during the 18th century, during the 19th century, during the period after the First World War, when from Max Weber to Lucien Febvre, La Terre, which is a program for world history, was published. And I also think that the moment after the Second World War, the Brodelian moment with the collaboration of some Portuguese historians or historians that had an interest on Portuguese imperial history, was also a very important moment. So my point here on global history is, after the reading of Pomerantz, after the reading of Goldstone and others, is to know what is the great advantage to emphasize the new turn on global history. And I think that at least in terms of research and also in terms of teaching, it makes no sense. It would be much better to take on board all this tradition, precisely because this tradition, at least if we go back to the 18th century, integrates a series of criticisms on Eurocentric or Western-centric perspectives. if we go back mostly to the 18th century, we can reconstruct all these line of criticisms from Reynal to many others that took position against Eurocentric perspective. Second point, imperial history. I said that it's the legacy of colonial and imperial history is so fresh for us as Portuguese that we don't need to be reminded that imperial models are still present, because in my opinion, and as far as I'm able to see, the legacy of the Portuguese Empire is present in a sort of everyday basis, and it reappears under many forms, sometimes under the forms of this social science vocabulary, for instance. And I think that the most, there are perhaps two main concepts that are concepts embedded in the social sciences vocabulary that have contributed to recently to create a huge confusion about ways of studying the empires. One is around notions of hybrids, hybridization, miscegenation, with a postmodern hint, but with very strong implications in our way of studying imperial history at large. And when I'm saying at large, I'm referring to a large period from at least the 15th century to the 20th century. And all the implications of these vocabulary from the postmodern Homi Bhabha ways of thinking about the global world nowadays in terms of figures around hybridization should be considered as very delicate in terms of our understanding of imperial history. I'll explain later why. The second is something that was created some years ago by Denis Lombard, who was perhaps the first to create a sort of misunderstanding when he criticized the use of the term empire to designate the Portuguese presence overseas, against mostly Boxer and Magalhães Godinho, the very influential book by Denis Lombard raised this criticism that was, after him, mechanically accepted by some of his students. He proposed, as an alternative model, Lombard talked about a certain analyse très fine de la façon dont les Portugais se glissèrent dans les réseaux préexistants, sans essayer d'imposer un ordre politique nouveau, which means that after Lombard, empire, or the Portuguese Empire, at least during the early modern period, but with strong implications in the ways of understanding the Portuguese Empire during the 19th century and the 20th century, was euphemized. There was no empire, only that kind of réseau, only that kind of networks. And I think that the huge confusion substituting empire by networks created also an euphemistic perspective of empire. So miscegenation on the one hand, or figures of the hybrid or hybridization on the one hand, and on the other hand, all this talk about networks. Of course, networks of trade existed, and we should consider all these networks, but they cannot be taken as a substitute to understand what an empire means. Even, I should say, and I've this example in the paper, even in very small ports of trade, when the Portuguese were able to develop and to express coercion, armed trade, violence, and when they were able to impose some exploitation, they had no doubts to use all these forms of dealing in a colonial situation, let me say. There is a third point that I also would like to raise after ways of understanding global history at large and ways of understanding imperial history, not in an euphemistic way, praising networks and miscegenation, but regarding forms of violence. There is a third question that I would like to raise, and it's a question that Francesca and Jack Goldstone know much better than I, which concerns modernity and notions of modernity that are all the time crossing the Portuguese mind, or the Portuguese mind of historians, because we are all the time thinking about the fact that we are late, that we took a certain delay, that we are not modern enough in order to go with the others, that we represent something that is more or less underdeveloped, and there is this constant reflection about modernity. And the constant reflection that we develop about modernity is not only a question about multi-centric modernities during the early modern periods in comparison with more unified, a more unified world under the Western dominance during after the Industrial Revolution or after 1800s. No, I think that we all have the experience of dealing with this tension, this perhaps more Norbert Elias tension in terms of ways of thinking about modernity. what is modernity? How can we play with modernity in order to study at the same time global history and in order to make a comparative history of empires? And here I think that divisions that were stressed more recently by historians like Ken Pomeranz, instead of helping us, I think that they contribute to create more divisions and to to create perhaps more problems to our ways of thinking about modernity. Why? Because we are constantly facing the notion that the Portuguese Empire is never working. The Portuguese Empire is never able to concentrate resources to have at its disposal the infrastructural power in order to develop forms of colonialism and forms of controlling all the territories all over the world. And this is precisely a question that when we are able to at least to grasp that kind of more rational, more modern ways of controlling from an institutional point of view, from the point of view of the instruments of coercion, we can call all that kind of apparatus more modern. And this is a concept that is valid to study the 15th century in the north of Africa, or it's also able to study under a completely different configuration what happened in Angola, for instance, in the 1960s. I think that there is, after global history, imperial history, and this reflection about modernity that in the paper I'm trying to locate around 1600 in order to challenge precisely the break pointed out by the so-called Californian school with Pomeranz and at the time also Goldstone also inside. After these three main topics, I think that it's impossible to avoid that we are also dealing with questions of identity, and inside questions of identity, questions of national identity. Of course, we are dealing with all these questions of national identity in a sort of permanent tension with perhaps the most important factor in order to understand in the long run the Portuguese Empire. I'm referring to the labor question. And it's not by chance that during mostly the second half of the 20th century, an official interpretation of the Portuguese Empire at large was spread, linking both aspects. On the one hand, the Portuguese were able to integrate, to assimilate, and not to exploit the locals, the natives. The Portuguese always used the locals in very euphemistic ways. Slavery, for instance, was almost forgotten from Portuguese historiography during the 20th century because it was under censorship or under different forms of censorship, and all the information regarding forms of modern slavery that circulated inside the official state and the official colonial state basically didn't reach other circuits of public opinion, even during moments of amazing international pressure. So on the one hand, we can think that what characterized in official terms the Portuguese Empire was precisely this way of dealing with labor, not exploiting the labor, which is almost impossible. On the one hand, there was, based on the work of the Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire, that was used by the official regime of Salazar, was this narrative about the capacity of the Portuguese to integrate, to assimilate, and the figure of the hybrids or the process of hybridization was perhaps the most important one. These references to these 2 points do not solve the question of national identity. The question of identity that is actually present in the essay by David Hume on nations. I mean, saying that with the European expansion, there was always a difference between different nationalities. And finally, there is a last point. I mean, and my last point concerns ways of reading the primary sources, ways of thinking about the colonial or the imperial archive in the long run, trying precisely to do what Francesca has already referred. I mean, to put together a global and imperial history using primary sources, not putting aside those primary sources, but trying to go to the archive and to use the embarrassing richness of primary sources that we have all over. I think that these 5 points that I tried to summarize here define perhaps a more pedestrian way of thinking about the link between imperial history and global history, and our way of addressing these 2 points from a Portuguese point of view in the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Diogo. So we now open the floor to the debate. We'll take a few questions before giving the speakers the possibility of replying. So whoever wants to be the first.
Well, I wanted to follow up, and I don't mean to, as I heard, one aspect of your question is that in your characteristically impressive synthesis, predictions are based on descriptions that naturally, capture certain features and potentially not others, which is a bit, what it may be grandiose terms I was trying to say about the micro and the macro, that when we describe something and we arrive at generalization. And so just to continue to be provocative, I want to make sure I ask you if I heard you correctly. Did you say that the United States was you didn't use the word unique, but an unusual Republican experiment based on the absence of landholding elites? And if that's the case, how do you explain the antebellum South in your story? Because that's a particular description of the United States.
May I add something too? How imperial is the imperial order that we are falling back into? Because I understand that this authoritarian drive and nationalistic drive is an important one, but is it imperial really, or is it based on nation states, some of them small nation states, which have no imperial ambition? So how imperial is in fact this model into which we are supposedly falling in?
I'll grab a few of these. All right. First on the dynastic principle and who will take over. You're correct. We see the dynastic principle coming back. The Gandhi family in India, the Assads in Syria, the Kim family in North Korea. So we still have that, right? Even in the United States, you have the Bush family, Clinton family, and the politician who was chosen to give the reply to President Trump's State of the Union address was Joseph Kennedy III. So partly it's, again, because when people are anxious and insecure, they go to what's familiar and continuous. And so you will see some of this name recognition. Now, when President Obama was elected, people were looking for something different, and they were willing to try something totally different and new. And periodically, we get this in democracies too. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton were kind of unexpected. And frankly, I expect whoever competes with Trump in the future will be someone unexpected. But his supporters are already talking, this is crazy talk, but you hear this, about Ivanka possibly being groomed to take over in 2024. So there is some of that, but the more serious notion is that in these modern imperial states, you get a strong individual who tries to control the succession by designation, identifying someone who will carry on for them. It doesn't have to be the same family, it doesn't have to be the same name, but it's usually, I will choose someone who I hope will carry on. An example of this that went badly was in Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak tried to place his son in position. He could have chosen almost anyone else in the military, and probably it would have been acceptable and he would have avoided being overthrown. But by choosing a family principle of succession over a designated institutional successor, he went awry. So I expect that just as Putin played games with Medvedev and Xi Jinping is putting his personal stamp on all of them, I think Xi will try and stay in power as long as he can. But the plan in all of these new imperial states is get rid of term limits, and by the time you face succession, have so much power that you can designate your successor. So that's more or less the answer to that. The new ruling class is the kind of loyal meritocracy. So if you are a loyalist to the new imperial leader, that's what counts. More than competence, in a sense, as well. You see that in Turkey, where the strong members of the AKP party were cast aside by Erdogan. So Gül, who I thought was a good guy, but cast out. So I think that's the real weakness of these new imperial type regimes, is the emphasis on loyalty. It's not a empire of the mind at all. It's much more an empire of the person who embodies the romantic ideal, and power basically will extend to that. Now, as you say, someone mentioned, what about the smaller countries, the Philippines, Poland, and Hungary? Are they really imperial? They don't have the same aspirations to control large parts of the world that Russia or China or the United States, with its 150 military bases around the world, has. But they do have the same kind of assertiveness. This Holocaust reshaping history law that Poland just passed is kind of reminiscent of the idea that we're going to control everything we can, and we're going to appeal to the idea of Polish nationhood to elevate it. The same with the Hungarians, are trying to reach out to reach Hungarians in other neighboring countries and integrate them into a notion of this greater Hungarian nation. So imperialism has degrees, I would say, between great powers and lesser powers. What they all have in common is putting a great deal of power in an individual ruler for the purpose of elevating the nation as a whole and making it safer and secure against its enemies, whether they're internal enemies, external enemies, or even enemies that attack the symbols and the history of that nation. Elites in the U.S. South, you're quite correct to call me out on that. The United States Constitution was a bunch of compromises and had anomalies. It was a free state that sustained slavery. It was a free nation based on representative voting, but allowed the southern states to count the population of slaves in calculating their presence in the Electoral College, even though the slaves who were counted as fractional citizens for that purpose were not allowed any citizenship rights or vote for any other. So there were these contradictions in the Constitution that were eventually resolved only through the question of either the South is so different with its planter elite and slavery that has to be removed from the United States, which was the goal of secession, or the planter elite had to be destroyed, which is what the Civil War and initial phases of Reconstruction tried to do. So you're right about that inconsistency, but it was more or less addressed to some degree in the 19th century. Now, racism continues in the United States. I don't want to get at all the continued flaws, but as an ideal, developing a large territorial state that would be governed by a constitutional, limited, representative government was a new departure. Even the Dutch Republic was more an assembly of autonomous, largely autonomous provinces under a merchant oligarchy with a kind of ambiguous continued relation to the stadtholder. So I think the Americans really tried to say, we're going to do a rational state. One last question, I think the renewable energy issue. You're absolutely right. The Japanese empire in World War II was fought to secure natural resources for the Japanese economy. Trump still talks about why is the United States fighting in Iraq if we don't get the oil. So there's all this thing about fossil fuels, like land, are a geographically located, valuable resource worth fighting over. And to the extent that we say, well, if we solve this just through nice trade networks, and we don't really need to exert raw, coercive power, then we're okay. But the reality is empires do exert coercive power, whether it's been the United States and Britain in the Middle East or Japan in East Asia, as long as there are these highly valuable, geographically located resources, there's a risk of conflict. Some people have argued that water may be the new domain. But I think the technology will eliminate that. Desalinization will make it cheaper than going to war in order to secure water. And I think renewable fuels will reduce the appeal of controlling fossil fuel resources. So I'm a little more optimistic there. What I worry about is more the symbolic aspects, the clash of civilizations, where national leaders have to justify their elevation of the nation by looking strong compared to competitor countries. And for that, you can take relatively worthless islands in the South China Sea and say, this is where we're going to show what a powerful nation we are. So I do hope renewable energy will reduce conflicts over fossil fuels, but I still think nations in an era of competitive nationalism will find other things to fight over. Let me just also add on Diogo's point. Portuguese history seems more inseparable from world history than that of any other nation that I can think of. In Britain, although it had this huge global empire, the academic teaching of history was there's British history, which goes through the monarchy and the struggles for power, and then there's imperial history, which is the separate appendage that you can study if you're really interested in studying the East India trade or what happened in South Africa and so on. But the scope and duration of the Portuguese Empire, and as you say, it's very currency. You can go to Macau and see what a Portuguese place it is. You can visit Angola, you can visit Brazil. It seems to me that because empire has been such a long, potent, inseparable part of Portuguese history, you can't talk about the Portuguese economy. You can't talk about what happened in Portugal in the 1970s. You can't talk about what happened in Portugal in the 1600s without reference to its global relationships. So I think you're absolutely right. This is a unique area to study empire, but probably not even thinking about it in the way other countries think of empire, as something somehow separate and foreign. Here it's not so separate, not so foreign, not so old. In the United States, of course, we don't think we have an empire at all. We have a current amnesia about that. But all of these are, you're quite right to point to the very different perspectives on empire we have in different countries.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Goldstone, anyone else?
Thank you for fascinating questions and reflections. I have two questions for the panel. You spoke about different degrees of empire. And I'm thinking about different degrees of resistance to different types of actors.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we make sense of a context like Syria, where you have a reassertion of old strategic actors and new types of actors? Are these new types of actors, or is just these new forms of resistance with old kinds of resistance? The second question: when we try and make sense of international organizations like the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, the Commonwealth, the Portuguese community of the community of Portuguese speaking countries, are they a continuum, or do they reflect a post-imperial vision and imagination?
Anyone else? Want to answer the question?
I'll let the other, excuse me, let the other panelists answer first, then I'll give mine.
Well, in order to answer the first question, which was not for me, but about different types of empire and different types of resistance, I would say that I don't like this kind of antinomy between empire on the one hand and resistance on the other. I think that there are so many figures that we can imagine in order to think about an imperial situation or a colonial situation, that the simple opposition between empire and the actors associated or ascribed to the empire and the forms of resistance do not work. I'm also against a a claim about complexities and stuff like that that doesn't help to think about these problems. But I should say that in the middle, we can, first of all, we should frame forms of collaboration and forms of thinking about different types of collaboration that are not necessarily associated with the empire, although they are important in order to supplement some functions, some imperial functions. So my way to answer your question would be it's not enough to have empire versus resistance. We need to consider other figures. Collaboration is one thing. Inter-imperial collaboration is another one under the frame of international organizations and other forms that are not necessarily under the empire. So it depends, and it depends on the different historical moments, and the generalizations here are difficult to make. Once we need to see, first of all, I mean, we can use, for instance, we translated into Portuguese a very useful book by Andrew Porter on the periods of imperialism, so around the Conference of Berlin. And he presents a very useful scheme where international relations, first of all, after the decision-making processes in the metropolis, and after what happened inside each empire, should be differentiated and studied in terms of the same configuration, but using different strategies. I mean, this is my answer.
I can add just a footnote, because a lot of these questions veer toward the contemporary, but I mean, empires create their own resistance, and the way in which resistance is articulated conceptually as well as in organizations' forms change because of the nature of empire. I'm just thinking, for example, among many examples, very provocative book by Andrew Sartori at New York University titled Liberalism in Empire, an Alternative History, which is, goes back to Diogo's point about can we use primary sources to write imperial history, has a incredible chapter about a Muslim Bengali leader of anti-colonial resistance in the early 20th century, who uses Lockean concepts of property to defend Muslim land ownership, right? So you cannot extricate the forms of resistance from the very nature, and this was not, with somebody who was educated locally. I mean, that's different from, circulation of Indian elites to Britain, I mean, it's just one example. One can think of, millions of examples of this sort that, just to add to what Diogo was saying about not creating, not reifying oppositions between sort of pre-constituted entities. And a British historian trained only with English or European languages wouldn't be able to tell that story, because wouldn't have access to the pamphlets and the type of literature that was produced by, Bengali communists and other unlikely unlikely resistors.
I apologize for my sniffling. I feel fine, but I forgot to bring my allergy pills. So that's what's happening up here. Quick on the degrees of empires. Look, obviously I committed terrible sins by treating the imperial form of government as something that's a generally applicable term. Any such label is going to be undermined if you look too closely at the variations among empires. But I think the variations are fascinating. The variations between the Spanish excuse me, empire and the New World, which had frequent rebellions, especially north of the Mexican border. The European empires, which claimed, as Diogo pointed out, they claimed to have a civilizing mission, but in fact brutally exploited the majority of their population, just as the US claimed to be creating a free country but retained slavery. There are a lot of inconsistencies because these things are created by human beings, right, who are not paragons of consistency. But it's not just European. The Chinese claimed to be bringing civilization to Korea and Vietnam when they disseminated the Confucian trained elite as the model for government. So the notion of empire has a cultural imperialism that is widespread. It has a strong distinction between elites who are engaged in politics and a passive population that is ruled. And it has a vested leadership in usually a particular individual with extraordinary power. Now, given that the citizenship democracy model was known to the Greeks and Romans, it's just surprising to me how little that model found expression anywhere else in the world for thousands of years. It was really limited to small, transient, mercantile city-states. Now, you can understand why groups of merchants whose wealth depended on being able to protect and exchange property under a contract regime liked having a rule of laws rather than people. But for any country where there was widespread landed wealth that had to be protected by coercing a labor force to work the land, clearly you didn't want anything like democracy or citizen government. You wanted a privileged elite to maintain authority. And that's just been the dominant rule. Now, people say, well, now that we have a world with widespread literacy and a huge service sector and land is not an important asset anymore, we should be fine. We have the conditions for democracy. But somehow in the last 20, 30 years, we've again seen huge increases in inequality, even in modern industrial economies, much larger increase. We thought we were going in the opposite direction. At least after World War II, for 30 or 40 years, we were seeing an increase in average income of workers, middle class. That's been reversed. In the last 30 years, we've seen big increases in inequality, and the wealthy have been able to use that money, something, again, that shouldn't happen in a Republican democracy. The very wealthy have been able to use their money to gain influence on political outcomes to a degree that's led many other people to feel disempowered. So this is why I think we are running in that direction again, even allowing for all the differences in empires. No two are exactly the same. Even allowing for the fact that we're in a modern world that is economically very different. Things don't always work out as we expect. In terms of technology, information technology, people thought that Facebook was going to be a great thing for democracy. At least Zuckerberg thought it was going to give everybody the chance to express themselves equally. Well, the problem with that is with no hierarchy of editorial authority, everyone who can speak equally expects every voice to be considered equally valid. And you are now in an information world where it's very easy not only for people to have different opinions, but to deliberately present falsehoods as truth and to dress them up and make them look indistinguishable from others. Now, if you have a technology that distorts the information field so that people don't know what is true anymore and cleave to kind of a tribal identity based on what they are inclined to believe is true, it's very hard for democracy based on a notion of rational appeal to a majority of informed voters to operate. So we may find that all of our great technology is also, you'll hear more tomorrow, Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, but our technology may be taking us in a way that empires ruled, which is empires ruled by dividing subject people and keeping them ill-informed. And if that's happening again, it makes me worry.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I have one small question for Professor Goldstone and two for the panel. You started your presentation by basically arguing that we are living in a moment of extreme and growing violence throughout the world. I would like to hear you about, Steven Pinker's thesis. This is not the last provocative book on the enlightenment, but on the angels of our nature, that completely contradicts that premise of your entire presentation. And for all of the members of the panel, two questions. First of all, I'd like to, several times during the whole presentation, there was this kind of a merger between what is global and imperial history. Frequently, the expression global and imperial history, or imperial and global history, as if they were exactly the same. They are not, of course. I would like to hear a little bit more about, let's say, the benefits, but also the danger and the limits of this close relationship between global and imperial history and global and imperial historiographies. And thirdly, perhaps more important, at least for those who work in Portugal, and especially in the moment in which we are addressing a doctoral program on global studies, to what extent is it possible to even think about globally without good libraries, without funds to put our students in good libraries, or to go to multiple archives, and to what extent, this kind of push towards new ways of doing historical thinking and also doing different history is possible in countries in which resources to do so are not available, or they are extremely scarce. So I would like to hear you a little more about what we could call the conditions before intellectual or methodological arguments, or regarding the possibilities of doing good global history.
Another question?
This is another complementary question. So, how, from if we follow the entire how is the multilateral framework that has been built on cooperation will be looked at by new balances of power? I'm thinking the UN, for instance, and how specifically is you envisage the balance of power within an experience, a model of such as the European Union?
Who wants to start?
I'm going to start with the easy question, which I really liked, your second question. And I've said on other occasions that global history, or whatever you want to call it, is the most expensive thing the Western powers could have created in historiography. And not to be biographical, but I grew up historiographically in Italy, and I lived in a historic town 5 minutes from the archives. And when I wanted to study another town, which was still in the same nation, but about 4 hours by train, I didn't have the money, to do that. But then within the United States, there's huge inequality. Diogo Ramada Curto was one of my teachers at Brown University, which is an Ivy League, without a law school and without a business school, which creates problems with alumni donations. Very interesting place, but not very rich. And I'm not that old, but when I went to graduate school at Brown, there were no packages of fellowships for foreigners. So every year I had to find some money. And thanks to Diogo, I follow the the documentary traces of various Sephardic traders. And it was okay to come to Lisbon because Diogo and other friends helped me with the Luso-American Foundation and so forth. But I could never get to Goa until I got to Yale. I said, oh, you want money to go to Goa? Sure, you can go to Goa. But if my first job, actually, by miracle was that, if my first job would have been somewhere else, I could have not written the same book. And recently I'm just finishing another book for which I used extensively an online database of European rare books called The Making of the Modern World, which is a very interesting concept, is the digitization of every holding of the Goldsmith Cross Library at UCL and Harvard Business School. And together they're considered to be what early modern thinkers thought the economy was, which means it goes from a price sheet to, you know, physiocrats' treatises. And I cannot give you this, I would have to look at my phone, which is obnoxious, but I could give you the statistics. But I would say, I know for sure that both Penn and until recently Cornell, which are both Ivy Leagues, did not have a subscription that's so expensive. There's something like, you know, of the 10 richest universities in the United States, 7 have that. And when it comes, you know, and the second country that has the most copies is Japan, and then there are a few copies in England and a few copies in Switzerland. I mean, it just, the level of inequality of access to resources to do global history, you know, these are just anecdotes. Somebody this morning said statistics don't bring things to life. I mean, I must be a weird person because numbers bring things to life to me. So, I mean, when I see these numbers, all these things we're talking about become very, very, very vivid for me. And on the other hand, there was a question we didn't fully address about things like lusophonie and other concepts, which are obviously extremely problematic politically. They're constructed concepts and so forth. But there are archival traces that are left within certain linguistic traditions. There are certain empires that brought, the Portuguese left a lot of documents in Goa, you know, but there's some microfilms here. There are some very messy boxes at the Archivo Ultramarino, which drove me crazy. But as far as I could tell, it was not a long line. I mean, there are possibilities. So I'm saying two things, you know, I'm saying that we need to acknowledge the asymmetry of access that different researchers have, and that I think we need to talk more about it, because this certain global history, although, you know, the people who hate capitalists the most at the moment are all at Harvard. So, I mean, obviously there's complicated ways in which these elites reproduce themselves, but there are also accessible sources within walking or tram distance from this building, from which certain kind of histories of the Portuguese Empire could be written. And I'm not here to, you know, teach any lessons, but, you know, Diogo kindly said to me, you know, there are archives in the Igreja dos Italianos, and I went in, you know, and nobody had looked at those archives, and, you know, he kindly pointed there to me, and there were interesting stuff, and then you follow them and you go to Florence, which, okay, it's expensive, but it's not that expensive, and you find the other parts. So I think what, you know, the politics of academia is about money, but it's also about a sort of mind frame. And I think we should talk about both things.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. I'm not going to try and improve on that one. I will say on the multilateral organizations, they can be either instruments of imperialism or they can be instruments of a law-based global order. To the extent that a multilateral organization is dominated by one or two countries within it, and to the extent that the other people feel that domination, it's not contributing to a global world order as much as it's contributing to a global hierarchy that serves particular interests. This is the problem with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, where the US is considered to be the country that provides the leader of one, Europe is the leader of the other. Countries sometimes find it useful to accept money from these organizations, but they also chafe against it, which is why China has developed its own International Development Bank as a rival and is trying to extend its influence through that. So that's a case where instead of having a larger, more democratically governed international financial development fund that is addressed to needs that are defined by the members, you have a large multilateral organization that is led by two major actors who determine the needs, and other countries are asked to meet their agenda, whether it's the Washington Consensus or whatever development fad is in these leading countries. Now, United Nations is not like that. The United Nations is a more genuinely multilateral organization where Security Council, even though there are only 5 permanent members, there are many other members who also contribute to the Security Council and certainly the General Assembly. The problem with the United Nations is precisely because it requires a certain surrender of sovereignty, it's a frozen organization. The members of the permanent members of the Security Council are never going to give up their seats. They're never going to vote to add more permanent members, even though it's ridiculous that, you know, on a population and economy basis, India doesn't have a permanent seat on the Security Council, or Brazil, but that's the way things are. So that's not going to, and because of that, it's not as effective as it could be, whether it's a peacekeeping organization. So the major powers use it for their own purposes. Russia and China use the UN to veto things that they don't like. The United States, if they can get the UN to condemn North Korea, then they say, that's great. Look at all the support we have in the UN. If the UN condemns Israel, the US says, well, we're not going to continue to give development aid to countries that vote against us in the United Nations. So while I think the UN is the right kind of organization, its ability to work in the world is affected by the degree to which other countries submit to that notion of a super sovereign, equally balanced organization. The European Union is kind of caught in the middle. On the one hand, the European Union wants to function like an assembly of equals that achieve a common policy by discussing and identifying common goals. In practice, some countries who are members of the EU feel that it infringes on their national sovereignty to an unacceptable degree. This could be the United Kingdom, which has voted to exit. Could be Greece, that said they weren't going to go along with the European Union banking requirements. It could be Poland and Hungary, who say they're not going to go along with the EU immigration rules because they're too much of an infringement. So I think the EU would like to create a model for a regime that transcends and overcomes petty nationalism, but they're not fully succeeding either. And the stronger nationalism is, the more difficult it is to cede any sovereignty to a kind of multinational, truly equal group. So I think the world is struggling to move in that direction. Some things, the Convention on the Treaty of the Sea, the ozone control, worked very, very well. Paris Accord, not working so well. So it's, I think, you know, it's a half full, half empty kind of situation. On Steven Pinker, Pinker used some of my data from one of my research projects. He was writing before the outbreak of the Arab Spring and the wars in Yemen and Syria and so on. But I think the single biggest contrafactor to his optimistic argument, and you could say, you know, the world's in better shape than it ever has been, mortality is lower than it ever was, more children who are born survive into adulthood, more kids get an education, far fewer people live on $2 a day or less. All of these things are good. But if you look at the data on refugees, if you treat displaced people as casualties of conflict, they're not necessarily dead or injured, so they don't show up in the comparisons with war dead, all right? But if you look at displaced people, the UN High Commission on Refugees says there's 60 million displaced people in the world today, the result of conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, Afghanistan, and so on. 60 million people affected by conflict, that's a large number, right? That's comparable to World War II. So until that number starts to shrink, I don't think you can say we're out of the woods on the degree to which conflict is disrupting lives.
I think that you are absolutely right. I mean, if I give the impression that I was overlapping the two concepts, I apologize. Global history is totally different from imperial history, And although I think that sometimes, mostly in Portugal, people try to sell imperial history as global history in order to avoid notions of or processes of exploitation, violence ascribed to the concept of empire. So this is the first part of my answer. The second part is actually related with some forms of circulation in the long run, and through different configurations that are in global history and cannot be reduced to imperial forms of existence. One of them is for sure networks of trade. Networks of trade are something different in comparison to what empires have been. So this is my answer to your question. My second answer is about is more or less the same of the brilliant answer that and very balanced answer that Francesca has given to you. There's no way to show up in Portugal as victims of a lack of conditions. I think that the richness of the archives is such that we should use that kind of richness. And of course, we don't have the libraries that Harvard or Yale or even Brown or the Library of Congress in Washington have. But I still think that resilience and insistence against everything, mostly against a certain traditional way of being in academia, should be the solution to in face of the status of the victim. Last question. The framework of cooperation and how the framework of cooperation works regarding mostly empires, but also forms of globalization. And here the United Nations or the large story of the United Nations that Miguel actually has been working on with one of his students provides, in relation to the Portuguese Empire, a wonderful example of how an institution, how an international institution can be at the same time a way of opposing an empire and an instrument to legitimize empires. And it depends on the situations, but there's no way to romanticize too much all these international organizations, all these forms of cooperation, and I also think that in relation to what the Portuguese after 1975 have been doing with the Lusophonic and the Lusophony and all these kind of organizations. I'm very skeptical about all these different ways of using this colonial legacy and to transfer and ways of transferring this colonial legacy to the present, including in relation to the normatization of the Portuguese language which is one of the issues of the lusophonic or lusophonia, or the relation with Brazil, for instance, is not at all solved. On the contrary, is a way of trying to impose new forms of colonialism over Brazil that don't work at all. So this is my answer, my spontaneous answer.
Start with the Catalan situation. Just as in the 19th century, you had European countries expanding their empires, Russia expanding its empire, but also nationalist movements in small states aiming to break up the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. We see today this same combination of large countries like China and Russia trying to expand their influence at the same time that small countries are emphasizing their unique nationhood, leading to threats to break up United Kingdom, Spain, Northern League in Italy, and so on. So for me, that issue is simply part of the modern increased salience of nationalism. Now, the role of private companies, they tried the same thing in the UK with Brexit. They didn't have the same effect. But the broader question of how much private companies are going to supplant the nation state has been around for quite a while. I don't think that private corporations will dominate the world to the diminished impact of nation states. I think what happens is you have some industries, finance, technology, energy, that become globally important for a particular period in time because of their large revenues, and it takes governments a while to figure out how to reassert their control over them. We're seeing in Europe now efforts to exert control over Google and Facebook. China has figured out how to control its domestic internet. It excludes foreign internet companies, but it's figured out how to control its domestic internet companies fairly thoroughly. And I think we generally are going to see nations forcibly fight back. They have the resources in terms of lawmaking capacity and the ability to hire their own experts to be able to prevent private firms from becoming more dominant. The space race, what I imagine is that to the extent that the United States government and the Russian government paved the way for space travel, they're happy to let private companies try and make a profit out of it if they can, just as the government pioneered the internet and is willing to let private companies make a profit from it. That doesn't mean that once regular travel to the moon or Mars becomes established, it'll be completely free from government regulation or intervention. I think that's not true. Rather, if Musk is able to set up a passenger service to the moon, he'll have to meet federal safety standards. He'll have to be aware of international treaties that affect the free movement of satellites in suborbital space and so on. So there is a give and take. Corporations grow in power, but then the governments find a way to limit that power when it suits them.
Any more questions? So we're done for this afternoon. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you for the audience and your questions. It was a very interesting and thought-provoking debate. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.